She didn't dare move. His hand was still gripping her waist, hot, firm, burning through the thin layer of her nightgown. His breath pulsed against the back of her neck in uneven waves, fast and heavy, mixing with the scent of sweat and the faint aroma of soap. The kind of scent a man carries right after stepping out of a shower, still warm, damp, and full of raw heat. "Oren, stop," Myra whispered through clenched teeth, her voice caught somewhere in her throat like a knot. She had said that before, 3 times in fact, but this time, even she wasn't sure if she truly wanted him to stop. His hand slid higher from her waist, slowly rising to just beneath her chest, where the fabric of her thin nightgown barely concealed anything at all. She trembled. That feeling wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something deep and long suppressed, a hunger suffocating in silence, now surging through her with every throb of her body. Myra could see herself clearly in the mirror across from the bed. A woman nearing 40, hair tousled, eyes glassy, cheeks flushed with a mix of shame and desire, being held from behind by the very boy she once called her son. His hand was slipping beneath the folds of her gown as if the outside world had crumbled away, leaving only the two of them, bare, entangled in a delirious, sweet madness. "Stop calling me your son, Myra," Oren whispered into her ear, his voice hoarse like it was scratching against her skin. "Tonight, I'll show you exactly who I am." The late afternoon sun spread gently across the train platform as Myra stood among the hurried crowd, clutching the strap of her bag tightly, eyes scanning for a figure she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. The last time she'd seen Oren was on a misty morning, when she'd sent him off to study abroad and had tried her best to hide her tears behind the foggy car window. When he stepped out of the carriage door, Myra almost didn't recognize him. Oren was taller now, his shoulders broader, chest fuller, walking with the quiet confidence of a man who had already crossed that invisible threshold of boyhood. His tanned skin brought out the sharper angles of his face, and his eyes, no longer those of a boy who used to nestle in her arms, but calm, steady, and so grown that when they finally settled on Myra, she found herself faltering. "Oren," she stepped forward, arms slightly open, but the hug she had meant to give halted halfway. He didn't throw himself into her like he used to, not the way a child once clung to her after every exam. He just stood there, smiling, and let her wrap her arms around him. It was a polite hug, familiar, but strangely distant. "You've grown up so much," Myra blurted out, and immediately regretted how silly it sounded. He tilted his head slightly, gave a soft smile, his voice deeper, more textured than she remembered. "And you haven't changed at all, Mom." That word, Mom, came out like a breeze, yet it landed on her chest like a warm stone dropped into cold water. That evening, Myra started dinner earlier than usual, preparing black pepper fish, the dish Oren used to love. Somewhere between seasoning and setting the table, she realized something. It had been a long time since she'd put effort into a proper meal like this. No one else had lived with her in this house for 2 years. Only the hum of the fridge and the soft glow of the hallway lamp had kept her company each night. Oren stepped into the kitchen just as Myra was slicing onions. She didn't turn around, but she sensed him, his scent, clean and masculine, lingering with a hint of soap and subtle musk. He had just showered, and the warmth of it still clung to him, made her throat tighten. "The bathroom's still exactly the same," he said. "Yeah, I haven't changed anything," she replied, her knife slipping slightly, the blade nicking the tip of her finger. Blood welled up, not much, but enough to make Oren step closer. "Let me see," he said gently, taking her hand and turning her thumb upward. His breath was close to her cheek. Myra shivered not from pain but from the feel of his hand. It was warmer than she remembered, broader, with a faint roughness in the palm. She pulled her hand back too quickly, like she'd touched something electric. "It's fine. I can handle it." Oren smiled but said nothing. Yet before he turned away, his eyes lingered just a moment too long on the spot where the blood had appeared. Dinner was quiet but pleasant. Mostly, Myra asked questions about school, friends, the food, the weather, and Oren answered briefly, calmly. He wasn't the same boy who once rambled about stray cats in the backyard. He sat across from her now like a man, composed, steady, but his eyes never left her. They watched her every movement. How she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, how she gently licked the tip of her chopsticks after tasting the soup. "How long do you plan to stay?" Myra asked as she gathered the dishes. "I'm not sure, but I'd like to look for a job nearby. If things work out, maybe I'll stay." She froze. Stay for good. She should have felt happy. But her heart skipped a strange, disoriented beat. Then she nodded quickly. "Well, this house will always be your home." That night, Myra couldn't sleep. She lay on her side, eyes fixed on the doorway, where the hallway light cast a faint golden line across her floor. She didn't understand why. When she recalled Oren's eyes in the kitchen, her chest tightened in a way she couldn't name. "No, it's just been too long since someone was here. That's all." The sound of running water came from the bathroom, probably Oren washing up. She pulled the blanket higher, trying to chase the thoughts away until she heard a soft click. Her bedroom door wasn't locked. Oren stood in the doorway. The warm glow of the hallway light framed his figure. He was only wearing a pair of light cotton pants, bare-chested, with damp hair falling slightly over his forehead. In his hand was a glass of water. "You're still awake." Myra sat up abruptly, tugging the blanket up instinctively. I was just thirsty, too lazy to go get it." He stepped forward, placing the glass gently on her nightstand. "You forgot to lock your door." "Yeah, old habit," Myra replied, forcing a weak smile. Her throat felt even drier than before. A strange tightness bloomed in her chest and traveled downward, a quiet heat crawling beneath her skin, making her unable to meet his gaze. "Sleep well," Oren whispered. But as he turned to leave, his eyes flicked, briefly but undeniably, down toward the thin fabric of her nightgown. It clung to her body slightly from the light sheen of sweat, revealing almost every curve beneath. He said nothing more. But that look was no longer the gaze of a son toward his mother. The door closed softly behind him, but Myra's heartbeat didn't calm for a long, long time. A week had passed since Oren returned home. Myra gradually realized she was lying to herself. Boldly. Shamelessly. She didn't dare step into the bathroom if he had just come out. Not because of modesty, but because his scent lingered, cool mint soap, warm humidity, and sometimes the clean trace of masculine sweat soaked into the towels. She hated herself for breathing it in deeply. She began to wear more modest nightgowns, but Oren's gaze didn't change. It remained gentle, quiet, and yet it burned her every time it paused on her neck, her shoulder, or the glimpse of her cleavage through her blouse. One afternoon, Myra was in the laundry room. She bent down to pick up Oren's clothes. A pair of black underwear slipped out, still carrying the scent of his body. She was about to toss it straight into the machine, but her hand paused. For a few seconds, then a faint breath escaped her lips. She dropped it in, hand trembling. That day, the heat was unusually intense. Myra took a late shower, sweat clinging to her skin, but she forgot to bring a towel. Oren was the only one home. She peeked out of the bathroom door, checking empty living room, silent hallway. She rushed toward her bedroom, body wrapped in nothing but a thin white towel, wet hair dripping. She didn't know Oren had just come up from downstairs. They ran into each other in the hallway. His eyes stopped and didn't blink. Myra froze, completely. Her fingers gripped the towel tight, but it had already slipped slightly at her chest from running. One breast was nearly exposed, the shape of her nipple pushing against the damp, translucent fabric. Oren didn't look away. He didn't pretend to be polite. He looked directly like a man seeing a woman, not a son seeing his mother. Myra stepped back. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she whispered. Her voice weakened. She didn't understand why her heart was racing like someone caught in sin. And worse, why between her thighs she felt that slow, rising heat like a spark waiting to spread. Oren didn't apologize. He simply gave a small nod and said quietly, "I'm sorry, but I can't pretend anymore." That night, Myra didn't sleep. She lay on her side, legs drawn up, her hand resting between her thighs, mind blank. But her body was anything but. Every time she closed her eyes, Oren's gaze came back to her, and this time not just his gaze. She let her hand slide lower, just below her navel. Her fingers trembled when they touched that warm, damp place. A soft, stifled sound escaped her throat, a moan, faint and desperate. She shut her eyes tighter. The image sharpened. Oren, his bare back, his defined chest, his hands trailing up her waist, his lips on her neck, and his voice, breathy and thick with heat, whispering, "I don't want to be your son anymore." Myra's fingers were soaked, her lower back arched. She bit her lip to stop the sound from escaping. For the first time in years, she pleasured herself because of someone who lived under the same roof. And worse, someone who once called her mother. Her breathing became ragged, her entire body trembling like a wave of electricity rushing through her spine. Her fingers moved deeper, harder, until she choked on a moan, burying her face in the blanket, body convulsing in a release so fierce, it scared her. Her vision blurred. She gasped for air, staring at the ceiling, the weight of guilt crashing down like a flood. "You're insane, Myra, completely insane." A soft ting sounded from her phone, a message from Oren. "I didn't mean to stare, but I still can't forget it." Myra sat up, heart pounding. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling, but she couldn't type anything back. She just lay down again, eyes wide open until morning. 2 days passed, and Myra could barely bring herself to meet Oren's eyes. She busied herself with cleaning the bedroom, reorganizing old books, anything to keep her hands moving, her mind distracted. But her body didn't forget. Every time her fingers grazed the collar of her shirt, the hem of her gown, or the bare skin of her thigh, she would hear the echo of her own moan, choked, heavy with guilt, and terrifyingly depraved. Oren, on the other hand, didn't avoid her. Whenever they crossed paths, he remained calm, composed, but there was something electric beneath that stillness. His gaze peeled back layers of fabric from her body without ever touching her. That look of his wasn't invasive. It was reverent, dangerous, undeniably male. That afternoon, a thunderstorm gathered over the horizon. Lightning ripped through a sky stained with dark violet. The electricity went out suddenly. Myra was changing in her room when the house went dark. She grabbed a thin nightgown and threw it on, lighting a few candles in the living room. Rain lashed against the window panes. She sat curled up on the sofa, cradling a cup of hot tea, trying to appear calm. Then she heard soft footsteps behind her. Oren. He held a candle, too. His t-shirt was damp from sweat and rain, clinging to his torso, outlining the tight curve of his chest and abdomen. The candlelight danced across his face, carving his features deeper, drawing shadows under his eyes that drank her in without blinking. "You couldn't sleep either?" Myra asked, her voice faltering. "No," Oren replied, stepping closer and placing the candle on the table. He sat down across from her, gaze unwavering from the thin white fabric clinging to her body. Silence thickened between them. Then he asked, "If I stopped calling you Mom, then what would you be?" Myra stiffened. "What are you saying?" "I mean, if I weren't your adopted son, what would we be?" The room seemed to close in on itself. Outside, the rain kept pouring. Inside, Myra's heartbeat thundered in her chest, loud and aching. Oren stood up. He walked behind the sofa and stopped just behind her. Myra didn't dare turn around. Then she felt his breath, a whisper of heat brushing against the back of her neck. His hand touched her shoulder, for the first time truly touched her. Not by accident, not in passing. This was intentional, deliberate, and it shattered whatever fragile boundary still remained between them. She shivered. "Oren, stop," she whispered, barely audible. "I'm not your son, not right now," he murmured beside her ear. His lips were so close, Myra could feel the warmth radiating from them. "I grew up watching you every day. Your body, your scent. The way you stepped out of the bathroom with wet hair, your dress clinging to your skin, you think I never thought about this." Myra turned around, but she didn't speak, because her lips met his, accidentally but also inevitably. It wasn't a planned kiss, but it was one they had both imagined, long before this moment. Oren's lips were soft and warm. He kissed her gently at first, then deeper, more hungrily, his tongue finding hers, full of yearning. His hand wrapped around her waist, pulling her in. She felt his body, firm, hard as stone, pressing against her chest. She gasped. "We should." "But you want to," Oren whispered. His hand slid beneath her gown, caressing the skin of her abdomen, warm, trembling, slick with nervous heat. Myra let out a soft breath, the kind of sound born from surrender. She didn't push him away. Instead, her back arched when his hand reached the soft curve beneath her chest, his fingers tracing every inch as if he wanted to memorize her. She drew in another shaky breath. "No, Oren, not here." He paused, but his eyes didn't waver. "Not tonight," she murmured. "If you still respect me, let me sleep." Oren looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned in, pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I won't sleep, not unless I'm dreaming of you." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Myra sitting alone, chest rising and falling, her legs pressed tightly together, hands trembling, and a hollow ache spreading in her chest. Like someone had wrapped invisible fingers around her heart and squeezed, slow, unrelenting. Myra wasn't sure what made that afternoon feel so unusually different. Maybe it was the sunlight lingering too long on the roof, warming the air of the downstairs room with a blend of early-season milkwood blossoms and a faint, sticky heat. Maybe it was the sheer thinness of her nightgown. Or perhaps her mind was simply too exhausted from countless sleepless nights, worn down from trying to forget what had happened. 3 days had passed since that night, when their lips found each other in the dark, between the rain and the flickering shadows of candlelight. 3 days since Myra felt Oren's arms wrapped around her, no longer like the embrace of a son, but like the grip of a man searching for warmth in the woman he used to call mother. Myra had tried to escape. She buried herself in chores, spoke only in short sentences, and avoided Oren's silent stares. But she couldn't run from herself, from her own body, from the aching warmth that pulsed between her thighs every time she remembered his breath brushing against her ear. She stepped out of the bathroom, hair still dripping, wearing nothing but a smoky gray silk nightgown clinging to her skin. A slippery fabric that exposed nearly every curve of a woman well past 30, but still tender, still painfully soft. She assumed Oren had gone out, as he always did on late weekend afternoons. But just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, their eyes met. He was standing by the bookshelf, flipping through an old notebook. And in that fleeting moment when he looked up, his gaze didn't stop at the page, nor at her face. It locked onto the whole of her figure, framed in the golden light of dusk, wrapped in a layer of silk as thin as mist. She froze. The entire space seemed to tilt, sucked into a thick silence. All that remained was that gaze, like a slow-burning heat wave, piercing through fabric, brushing every inch beneath her skin. Myra knew exactly what that look meant. It held no innocence anymore. It was deep, dense, and filled with something desperate to be released, like magma straining beneath the final crust. "Oren," she whispered, the sound barely a breath. He didn't answer. He simply walked toward her, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the delicate tension in the air. Myra wanted to step back, but her feet felt glued to the tiled floor. All she could do was clutch the hem of her nightgown, her palms damp with sweat. When Oren stood in front of her, only a breath away, he murmured, "You didn't lock your door. I thought you weren't home. I always come home. Because you're still here." Myra's chest tightened. She couldn't bring herself to look into his eyes, but his face was now so close. His skin, that familiar scent, part memory, part danger, was suddenly too much. The comfort of shared years twisted into something volatile, melting her spine. Oren lifted his hand, not to touch her skin, but to brush a damp strand of hair off her shoulder. He tucked it behind her neck, his gaze never leaving her face. Then, in a near whisper, he said, "You can say no, but don't pretend you don't feel this." In that moment, Myra closed her eyes, not to refuse, but to surrender. She felt his lips press against her cheek, feather-light like a breeze. Slowly, they trailed downward, toward her neck. Her head tilted slightly, instinctively, as if that spot belonged to him. When his mouth paused at the hollow of her collarbone, Myra let out the softest breath, a sound that shattered every last barrier within her. She didn't stop him when his hand slid around her waist, slipping beneath the silk. Skin against skin, hot, smooth, trembling, he wasn't rushing. He only touched, carefully, deliberately, like she might vanish at any moment. When their lips found each other again, the kiss was no accident. It was a confession spoken without words. Oren kissed her like he'd waited a lifetime. His lips were warm, his tongue slow and aching, and his hand gripped her back, pulling her against him, against a desire that had long outgrown restraint, now impossible to hide. She couldn't recall how she ended up on the sofa, or who moved first. She only remembered the moment her back hit the cushion, sunlight pouring through the window, bathing them in golden haze like a dream. She lay there, breath hitching, fingers clutching his arms as if letting go would shatter everything. His hand slid up her neck, then down the curve of her spine. Her body arched in sync with every graze of his touch. He wasn't just touching her skin, he was reaching into her mind, unraveling every last thread of logic. Myra had never felt so fragile, yet never so much like a woman. He whispered into her ear, "Do you want me to stop?" Myra opened her eyes. She looked at him for a long, trembling moment. She knew right then that whatever she said would change everything. But her lips parted and a single word escaped, barely audible. Do. And so they surrendered to it all in silence, in sunlight, in a tidal wave of emotion that had no name. No more words were spoken, only breath. The soft friction of skin, the rhythm of heartbeats, the subtle quake of every unspoken need. Everything was gentle. And yet, Myra knew she had crossed the point of no return. She had allowed herself to touch the forbidden. And she had allowed Oren, not her adopted son anymore, to call her by the name that, until now, had only existed in their dreams. When it ended, the light had dimmed. Myra lay curled in Oren's arms, her head resting against his chest. Her heartbeat echoed like silent confessions, steady and quiet. She didn't cry. But deep inside, she knew, after today there was no way back. The next morning, Myra woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains. A light that should have felt harmless, but instead tightened painfully around her chest. She lay alone in bed, the pillow beside her still bearing the imprint of another body, faint traces of skin and warmth left behind from a night that should never have happened. She reached out and touched the sheets. The very place that had been damp just hours ago with panting breaths, desperate grips, and whispered words that had swept her into a sweet, dizzying haze mixed with terror. Myra didn't know what to call what had happened between them. Was it sex? Passion? Weakness? Or something deeper that she dared not name? She only knew one thing. From the moment Oren touched her, with his eyes, his hands, his lips, every definition of mother and son inside her had been torn apart. She avoided Oren. She no longer spoke to him, no longer cooked dinner, no longer waited up for him as she once did. In the evenings, when he came home, her bedroom light was already off. In the mornings, when he woke, Myra had already slipped out of the house. She didn't go anywhere in particular, just wandered through the park, sat alone in strange cafes, watching people pass and trying to draw a new boundary for herself. But the more she avoided him, the more tangled her heart became. There were nights Myra shot awake from her sleep because of an imagined touch, a whispered name in her ear, or simply because her body would suddenly burn with a wave of longing, just from recalling the memory of his breath on her neck. By the third night, Myra couldn't take it anymore. She left her room in the silence of midnight. The living room was quiet. Only the dim night light glowed. Oren sat on the sofa, not watching TV, not listening to music, just sitting there with his head in his hands, eyes so weary it made Myra pause in the doorway. He looked up when he saw her. They stared at each other for the first time in 3 days. Myra opened her mouth, but nothing came out, just a faint, choked sound. Oren stood up slowly, moving closer. "Do you hate me that much?" he asked, his voice rough, like someone who had wandered the desert too long. Myra shook her head. "Then why do you make me feel like a criminal?" His eyes were pained, not angry, just broken. Myra clenched her hands. She wanted to say, "Because I'm your mother." But the words stuck in her throat. They didn't mean anything anymore, not after everything she'd allowed to happen between them. "I'll go," Oren said, "tomorrow morning. If you don't want me here, just say the word once." The air suddenly felt cold. Myra swayed on her feet. "No," she replied, just one word, but her whole body trembled like a brittle branch. He looked at her, saying nothing. She stepped forward, not fast, not slow, but her eyes never left his. When she stood right in front of Oren, Myra looked up and whispered, "I don't hate you. I hate myself." Oren reached out and touched her cheek. She didn't pull away. "I'm so tired," Myra whispered. I don't want to think anymore. I don't want to fight anything anymore. I just want just one night's peace. In your arms. Don't call me mom. Don't call me anything. He pulled her into his embrace. That warmth, Myra knew it so well, but now it made her tears come. That night, they didn't say anything else. Oren gently led Myra to her room as if guiding someone lost. She lay on her side, back turned to him. But when he drew the blanket over her shoulder and wrapped his arms softly around her from behind, Myra didn't resist. She closed her eyes and let it all happen. And then, in the pale, misty quiet, they found each other again. There was no rush like the first night, no wild surge of immediate desire, just gentle touches along her neck. Fingers tangled with fingers. Lips nestled behind her ear, leaving warm breaths that made Myra want to cry. She felt every movement of his body behind her, slow, steady, as familiar as the waves meeting the shore. She didn't have to see him to know that Oren was holding her as something real, not out of lust, but with a sense of belonging. In the darkness, Myra moaned softly, without restraint. It wasn't the sound of guilt. It was the sound of someone who had finally let go, allowing herself to be loved for the first time after years of fleeing every feeling. They lay together for a long time afterward, not sleeping. Myra eventually turned, resting her head on his chest. Oren slid his fingers through her hair, stroking her slowly. "I used to think," he began, "that you were someone I could never have." Myra gave a faint smile. "Because you called me Mom." "No," Oren whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Because you always seemed too high, too distant, too beautiful. I never dared reach for you. But now I know you were lonely too." Myra said nothing more. She just moved closer, just a little. That night, for the first time in years, she slept deeply in a stranger's arms, and yet it felt almost like coming home. Myra sat quietly at the kitchen table, a mug of ginger tea cooling in front of her. The morning sun poured through the window, painting everything in gold, but inside she felt gray, as if a summer storm was still brewing in her chest. She heard footsteps on the stairs, the familiar, measured tread of Oren coming down, hair tousled from sleep, eyes still soft with leftover dreams. He entered the kitchen, lifting the hem of his t-shirt, and smiled at her with the ease of a son, a friend, a lover, every role at once. But Myra felt nothing was ordinary anymore. She had lost count of the nights she had let Oren touch her, not just with his hands or lips, but with something more dangerous: surrender. Trust. The willingness to let him tear down her last defenses, to believe in a feeling she had spent a lifetime denying. "I called the electrician this morning," Myra said, her voice neutral. Oren nodded, asking nothing. He sat across from her and just looked for a long moment. "If we keep living like this," Myra finally whispered, "what will happen to us?" He didn't answer. She went on, "One day someone will find out, they won't accept us. You'll be hated, and me, they'll call me something unspeakable." Oren reached for her hand. "Then why can't we stop?" he asked, his voice almost broken. She smiled sadly. "Because I didn't stop you when I could have." That afternoon, Myra went to the supermarket nearby. While picking apples, she unexpectedly ran into their old neighbor, Mrs. Alira, the sharp-eyed gossip. The woman gave a knowing smile. "Your boy, a grown man now, isn't he? Handsome, tall, almost looks like your husband." Myra stiffened, forcing a polite laugh, but the words struck deep, piercing the thin shell she had tried to build around herself. People were noticing. They were starting to wonder. The world outside would never be as gentle as the quiet moments she shared with Oren. That evening, when she got home, Myra sat for a long time outside Oren's door. She breathed in, knocked softly. He opened it, surprised, but didn't say a word. She stepped inside. The soft, yellow light of his lamp fell across her face, tired, resolute. "I can't keep doing this, Oren. We're living in a box. Outside is a world that will crush us if it knows. I'm not afraid. I am, not for me, for you." He grasped her shoulders. "I don't need anyone but you. But you need a future." They held each other's gaze for a long, silent time. She didn't cry, but her eyes were wet. Her voice trembled. "I love you more than I should, but if I keep you here, I'll destroy you in ways you don't even see." The next morning, Oren was gone. He left a single note on the kitchen table. "I'm not leaving to abandon you. I'm leaving to give us a chance to come back with our heads held high. I'll become someone worthy, not as your son, but as the man who chooses you." Myra folded the note, holding it tightly in her palm, as if she could still feel the warmth of his touch in the paper. 3 months later. It was a late afternoon when Myra was watering the flowers outside the house. She heard a car stop at the gate. Oren stepped out, taller, surer, a little older, wearing a crisp white shirt and carrying a paper bag filled with a bottle of wine, a bouquet of lilies, and an old book Myra had been searching for in vain. She watched him as if seeing him for the very first time. He didn't call her by any name, he just smiled. "Are you expecting anyone?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, someone who once lived here." Oren stepped through the doorway, closing it gently behind him. And in their hearts, another door finally opened, not one of shame or fear, but of two souls learning to greet each other again, without pretense, with nothing left but the honest, trembling hope that what they shared could one day simply be called love.